At the very start of this campaign, you were sort of embroiled in a major controversy that had to do with illegal strip searches of teenage girls by one of your subordinates when you were a Wareham police sergeant. This sort of tainted your campaign as it was going underway, even though these incidents occurred nearly 2 decades ago. How do you explain to voters in the 10th Congressional District that you do not look the other way in a difficult situation when it involves friends?
Sure. Well, one of my primary opponents is trying to make this an issue. He's running kind of a negative campaign, doing some of the mudslinging and trying to bring up something that happened 20 years ago and, quite frankly, was vetted the first time that I ran in 2002. My opponents in October of 2002 did the same strategy. Let's do a guilt by association thing. But let me answer your question directly. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, I was a police officer in Wareham. I was a police sergeant, and one of my officers did an atrocious act. He illegally searched a couple of detainees.
Young girls,
Absolutely. Yeah. And it was horrifying. When we learned the truth, I was shocked. This was someone that I knew, someone who I had no information that he was capable of this. The entire department was very upset and disappointed. And ultimately, the officer, very quickly, by the way, the officer was suspended, he was terminated, he was prosecuted for his heinous acts. And it was, the thing that I learned about all of this is that you can't trust certain people. You can't just give your friendship, your trust. And it was, it was one of those life lessons to me.
But weren't you there at the scene, at least at one of these illegal strip searches?
I was not. There was an allegation that I was in sight of this, one of the allegations. I never saw anything wrong, in fact.
But you were there, but you didn't see it? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that's the allegation. The facts are that...
But were you there at the scene?
I was never at a scene where I observed anything that was inappropriate or wrong.
But you were at the general location?
That's correct. It was a cranberry bog.
And you resigned very suddenly, it seemed to very many people, about 6 months after the investigation started. Why did you leave at that particular point in time?
I left the department to start my own private investigation firm. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to start my own business, work for myself. And I had a series of businesses, and I love being an entrepreneur. I'm very happy with my police career. I enjoyed it. I learned a lot.
And this scandal had absolutely nothing to do with the timing of when you left?
That's correct. It was some 6 or 7 months after this incident.
There was a stinging controversy from a law enforcement specialist who said that you weren't being truthful. And that would hurt in and of itself, correct?
Well, this specialist that you're referring to was hired by the plaintiff in a civil lawsuit that was brought against the town. Let me be clear, and let's get this on the record, that I was never disciplined for any of my actions. I was never charged with anything. The case was either settled or a judgment against the town. I never spent a day in court. This wasn't an issue when I left the department. I left with letters of recommendation from my chief and my captain. It wasn't the reason that I left. But when you run for office, whether it be in 2002 or whether it be in 2010, your opponents can either decide to beat you on the issues, or they can try to...
And you feel like you have no responsibility for what happened whatsoever?
Sure,
even though you were there.
No, the entire department has responsibility. This was an officer who was under the department's control. This was an officer who was working on my shift, and he did wrong things, and so we all bear responsibility. The entire department, except for one officer, after the incident, signed a letter, and we believed the officer. There was an allegation made against the officer, and we believed him because we had no idea he was capable of this. In retrospect, obviously, it was wrong. Obviously, the department had an officer that was rogue, that was doing things it shouldn't. And that's why I'm glad he was suspended, he was terminated, and he was prosecuted, and he did time in jail.
All right, let's move the conversation to, and I recognize